Today, I once again have the pleasure to talk to Amandeep Singh Madra, the co-author of Eyewitness at Amritsar. If you wanted to know more about our guest, then I recommend you visit our first podcast that I had the pleasure to do, which is episode 15. However, coming back to today's episode, we'll be focusing on Jallianwala Bagh. Now, most of those people listening to the podcast are probably aware of, or in recent kind of news, are aware of Jallianwala Bagh because of the renovations. And I guess, in my opinion, it's just absolutely ludicrous what they've gone and done, and it's just disrespectful. But rather than us focusing on the renovations, which I know Amandeep Madra has done a podcast with Bars about this with Shabad Singh, which I definitely recommend you all to go and listen to that. However, today we'll actually be focusing on the events of Jallianwala Bagh, both prior and kind of post and the ramifications of that. So before we get going, I just want to say a massive welcome to our guest once again, and thank you for joining us.
Not at all, Ahmed. Thank you very much for having me on.
Awesome. So one thing that I guess is like personally curious about is, where does Jallianwala Bagh get its name from? Is there any special significance or kind of history behind the name?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually, because we don't really think about where names come from. And actually, if you're a Punjabi speaker, you can kind of deconstruct the name. So, Bagh obviously means garden, open space, whatever you want to call it. But Jallianwala is the Bagh that belongs to Wala, belongs to the Jallian, but which is a family called the Jalla family, or they were probably from the area of Jalla in Jalandhar, and it belongs to them. So Jallianwala Bagh. And it's something I think what's more curious about it is how it remained as a green space, a kind of an open space in that very congested heart of the old walled city of Amritsar. And sadly, we don't really know too much about it. It's fairly anonymous until the events of 1919. There's a few references, but you've seen, like me, you're fascinated by old photographs, Ahmed, and any of the older pictures that are taken of Amritsar, often they're taken from that tower, from the Baba Atal Burj, the tower next to the Harmandir Sahib, from the top of the Ramgarhia Bunga. You can see that even in the 19th century, it's retained as this kind of open green space where all around it is this sort of seething, teeming, busy, very urban city of Amritsar.
So would it be fair to say then that the family to which the garden kind of gets its name from would have been kind of a fairly established, kind of relatively rich family in order to have kind of, I don't know what the word is, purchased the land? Like how does that quite work? Because from the little that I read out of your book, Jallianwala Bagh, as in that space, was kind of just used as a dump really until kind of the events of 1919, and then after that things kind of cleaned up. So would that land just have been, I guess, that land would have been purchased for that family when they were visiting Amritsar, or would they have been living there? Because again, I found it really interesting that this tiny open space hadn't been built on, or nothing had been done to it. So it was just kind of curious as to why that may have happened.
Yeah, it's not super clear. Certainly by the 19th, early 20th century, it's a sort of scruffy open bit of land. Maybe in its past it was a bagh, it was a formal laid out Indian garden, maybe even a garden in the Mughal style like you had in the Ram Bagh gardens up north of Amritsar. What you see particularly in that area just surrounding the Darbar Sahib are lots of residences, guest houses, if you like, of nobility and big families in that area. So the Patialas had a place, the Faridkot family had a place. Some of the, like the Ramgarhia Bunga was obviously for people of that background, where it was both a place owned by this kind of nobility, but it was also used by their friends, family, acquaintances that kind of thing. So it's conceivable that the Jallianwala family had either had a place there, and that was the Bagh associated with their mansion house, their haveli, or actually that they had purchased it way back and never quite built on it, which is also likely. It also then, certainly by the early 20th century, because it's owned by 4 or 5 different families at that moment in time, you just don't know whether it was kind of disputed land, how long it had been disputed land for. It is really curious that nothing was ever built on it. There's something about it which means that it was left barren, and it is just a really obvious kind of great big green gap in the middle of a very sort of busy city.
Yeah, I remember the first time actually visiting Jallianwala Bagh. Obviously, this was like, I think 2001 maybe, or very early 2000s, and I would have been 10 or 11. So I remember obviously visiting on one side, and then you walk through all of these quite narrow passages, and all of a sudden you're in this huge garden, and it's this massive open space. And it is quite a kind of shock to the system, because you really don't expect that in that landscape. So yeah, hence the curiosity in those questions. Then just moving to kind of the context and the kind of the events that were occurring prior to 1919 and what unfolded. So in particular, I guess what I'm trying to point at is the Rowlatt Committee, and then kind of the First World War and its social economic impact on Amritsar, because there was, and again, like it's from your book, so you know better than I do in this context, but there was a line of thought which was basically that with all of these returning soldiers, there was kind of a worry that this would lead to some type of rebellion or mutiny or something or the other. And on top of that, there had been diesel prices had skyrocketed, price of grain had gone up, or like there was loads of social economic repercussions of the First World War, which obviously impacted India too. So I just wanted to get kind of a better idea really of the events leading up to Jallianwala Bagh, and kind of how the British Raj kind of tried to deal with it in the way they thought would work.
Yeah, it was. And context is all important, Ahmed, as you rightly say. If you don't have it, it's a bit abstract. The event, the actual massacre itself, is just a bit abstract. So the First World War has been incredibly important bit of a backdrop, and as you said, all of those sorts of things all of those sorts of social pressures were going on at the time. Grain prices had gone up because there were fewer men to tend fields, but there was also this demand to feed the Indian army as well. Fuel prices had gone up. Industry had been distracted and dismantled to service the war effort. There's also this political expectation as well. We at the beginning of the war, what political opposition there was, the sort of emerging Indian National Congress had thrown themselves into recruiting Indians for the First World War on the basis there'd be some kind of quid pro quo, some kind of political easing. And the demand was dominion status. It wasn't even independence. That was considered, way off. There were taxes that had been imposed on people. And then you had all these kind of other natural effects as well. There'd been heavy rains toward the end of the First World War, towards 1917, which had caused outbreaks of malaria and plague throughout Punjab, particularly in Punjab. I lost members of my family, I learned recently, due to the plague of 1917. And then in this kind of horrific irony, in the years of 1918, toward the end of the First World War, there were no rains, or very poor rains, which meant very poor harvest. And then what food was produced was being shipped out to Mesopotamia to feed the Indian army. And then, of course, as we all know, in 1918, there's the flu epidemic, the Spanish flu, which rips through India just like it ripped through many other countries, largely because men were returning from the First World War. Just to put the flu in context, we rarely ever talk about flu in Punjab, but 250 times as many people were killed in Punjab from Spanish flu as were killed as soldiers in the First World War from Punjab. So it's a much more dominant cause of loss and death and in that area. So this is really kind of socially ravaged by both political events, social events, and then just acts of God, if you like. Politically, there's also this awakening that's happening in the early part of the 20th century. I mean, we know in the Sikh world, for example, the Singh Sabha movement happens around about 1920. But just before that, of course, there's the Gadar movement that's happened during the First World War, this opposition to British imperialism, quite small, not very influential, not very popular across Sikhs. I think that's fair to say. But boy, did it have an impact on the British. I mean, they were absolutely petrified of it and brought it down very hard. Amongst the Hindus, there's the rise of the Arya Samaj, the self-governance and self-sovereignty movement under the Indian National Congress. And then for Muslims, there's this Khilafat movement, which just saw its kind of last legs at the beginning of the 20th century. So this is an attempt to try to re-establish Ottoman rule again in the Ottoman Empire. So there are a number of these kind of political movements that are happening just as the 1.5 million Indian men are coming back from the First World War, all armed, all trained, all suddenly have a much broader worldview, all have been told they've been fighting for freedom, all about to return to a country that's governed by Britain. And the idea then that this very conservative Indian government would dismantle all of the political restrictions and social restrictions that they had passed during the First World War in order to get through the First World War. The idea that they would do that is kind of unconscionable, really. It's far too much of a risk. So the British, they know they're under pressure. So their solution is to bring in this retired judge, Sir Sidney Arthur Rowlatt, who he makes a series of recommendations, which essentially are, let's continue with this kind of constrained political environment that we've had during the First World War, and it's those hated Rowlatt recommendations or Rowlatt Acts, because they became an act of parliament in the Indian Parliament, that leads to all of this rioting in the early part of 1919.
So just for those then who perhaps aren't aware of what these Rowlatt Acts essentially declared, was it simply just continuing the emergency kind of decrees and laws that the British had brought in during the First World War, or was there something additional to it? Was there like something extra added to it that kind of particularly irked people?
I mean, yeah, but I mean the political restrictions are fairly strong. I mean, you could have arrest without warrant, right? So, I mean, they're not. It's not as if they were sort of a mild strengthening of political power. This really was. They were really very serious powers that the colonial government had. So, arrest without warrant, indefinite detention without trial. The ability to be able to just exile people because they were seen to be troublesome, and during wartime this was seen as being acceptable. But after, in a time of peace, in a time when the country had to rebuild, and a time when people expected actually for there to be greater freedoms given to Indians, the idea that those sorts of things are continued, they sting that bit more.
No, I can well imagine. Just then focusing on the individuals who were mainly at play in this incident. So there's Reginald Edward Harry Dyer and there's Sir Michael O'Dwyer. And I think the similarity in the names is kind of one of those coincidences of life or history. I don't quite know, but it is it's a little bit interesting to say the least. Anyway, besides being infamous for leading and ordering the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, as well as being called the man who saved India by the Morning Post, which I found quite interesting that in your book you made it very clear it wasn't Rudyard Kipling saying that, it was the newspaper. Which I think is like very nuanced, but most people overlook that and will just say it was Rudyard Kipling who stated this. So who were these people? So who, like, as in, I think we all know, and again, I could have this completely the wrong way around, but if I'm correct, Dyer is the one who actually goes into Jallianwala Bagh, and O'Dwyer is the governor of the region and who basically agrees that what Dyer had done was fine. So besides those two kind of being related to Jallianwala Bagh and the horrific events of that day, who are they and why are they in the positions that they're in the first place?
Yep. So let's start with O'Dwyer. O'Dwyer is the older man. Actually, for Punjabis, he would be much better known of the time because Sir Michael O'Dwyer, an Irishman, iron-fisted political head of the Punjab. So the Punjab has, a bit like today, Punjab has a chief minister, the head of Punjab, and remember Punjab is a much bigger place in the early 20th century, is the Irishman Sir Michael O'Dwyer, phenomenally successful Governor General of the Punjab. During the First World War, he had overseen the recruitment of something like a third, about 500,000 men, about a third of the Indian army from the Punjab. Punjab makes up about 6% of the population of India, and he'd seen this phenomenal recruitment coming from the Punjab. He was this just phenomenal administrator, very, very well regarded, but ruled with an iron fist. He absolutely did. So he was, beloved by many, including the British, including people who, no doubt, had done really well under British rule, whether Indian or British, but also hated by many as well because he was like the political head. He's like the Boris Johnson of Punjab. He is the political head of that place. Now, Reginald Dyer, who's the military man, a younger man, so he's the man that goes into the Bagh, does the actual shooting itself, virtually completely unknown in Punjab. Will have been there. He had never gone to Amritsar, but he's a military man. He's second or third generation, I think, Indian. So I think he was born in India, like a lot of Brits were, that then went on to, serve in either civil or military aspect of the state. He obviously went into the military, had a reasonably good First World War, but really kind of unremarkable, but had progressed through the ranks in the Indian Army, and was kind of living the life of a good, upstanding member of military power in India. His family actually owned a very successful brewing company. So he was, he came from some wealth, but he was also absolutely committed to British rule in India. Neither of these men are particularly liberally minded or looking toward, a future where Britain does not rule India. In fact, both of these men will have been brought up to understand that British rule in India is pretty precarious. The British are outnumbered 1,000 to 1 in India, sometimes even less than that. Depends how many women and children there are in the country. But it's a really, they are massively outnumbered, and they rule by virtue of this very kind of intricate administration, the army, the police, but also civil power, huge amounts of civil power and local collaborators and all the rest of it. But they also know that there have been times, particularly Indian Mutiny in 1857, when the Indian Army turned against the British, or the East India Companies it was then, and they could get kicked out at any moment. So they absolutely know that, both of them know that at times like this, straight after the war, when there's all this sort of social and political tension going on, it's a dangerous time.
Just going off the back of what you mentioned about the Indian Mutiny, and it's something that appears kind of quite often in terms of the British bureaucracy, military, whoever are making the decisions at this point around Jallianwala Bagh, very much have the Indian Mutiny in the back of their mind almost as some type of like memory or disaster that they've been through. Now, considering Harry Dyer is the third generation born in India, he obviously would not have experienced the Indian Mutiny. Is much of this fear exacerbated by the British? Like, as in, do they kind of exaggerate the threat more than there actually is one? So one of the questions that got sent in by a member of the community was essentially that they had read that the reason the British took the action they did is because they were under the impression a number of revolutionaries were going to be present at this gathering, so and so. I couldn't find anything, but as in, is this kind of threat of there being a mutiny or some type of revolution kind of exaggerated past its reality, or was there actually kind of some type of real threat of something happening?
It's a good question. I mean, I would encourage anyone to read Professor Kim Wagner's book, Amritsar 1919, which is very readable. By the way, even though it's written by a university professor, it's not some deep academic book. It's actually incredibly readable. And actually, the subtitle to the book is "An Empire of Fear and the Making of a Massacre." So this notion of fear of the Indian Rebellion of 57, or Mutiny of 57, what you want to call it, the notion that looms over the British consciousness in 1919, I think he makes an incredibly compelling case that's what's going on. And if you know anything about 57 and this outbreak that happens in, I think it's Lucknow, amongst Indian soldiers, and then it kind of ripples through the entire Indian, throughout all of India, and it almost sees the Brits kicked out, well, massacred, frankly. The idea that the British had got very, very close to losing India from inside, I think actually would have loomed large in the mind, certainly of people like Dyer and O'Dwyer, and no doubt others as well. Whether it actually existed in April 1919, I think it's true to say that it didn't. These were not. This was not some kind of rebellion against the British. There wasn't a kind of a mass rebellion against the British going on, but the fear was definitely there amongst the Brits themselves.
No, that's a fair answer. Just another quick question, which was off the back of what you mentioned earlier about Edward Harry Dyer. So I read, I think, the first couple of chapters of Kim Wagner's book, and he talks about how I think the movie's the Gandhi movie, within which there's a portrayal of kind of Jallianwala Bagh and what happened. And again, he makes the very good point that actually most popular history of Jallianwala Bagh after that movie kind of pretty much comes from what is depicted in that movie. Now, one thing that's depicted in that movie, which I wanted to actually ask you about, was that Harry Dyer never actually fires a gun. Like, he walks in and he gives everyone else a command and they do all the shooting. Does he actually ever fire a gun, or is he just giving the orders?
He's giving the orders, and that typifies him. He is a man who gives orders and he expects them to be followed. And in any case, as a commander, as a man who wasn't under any personal threat himself, he would have had his service revolver with him in any case. But I don't think there's any evidence that he fires, because it's all, they count the ammunition out as they left their barracks in Rambagh, and then they counted in what was left over when they came back. So there's, typically great record keeping by the Indian Army. So it was only rifles that were shot in the actual massacre itself, and he wouldn't have picked up a rifle and shot it.
Okay, no, that's just interesting, just because it gives you obviously an insight into him as well as an individual for kind of what happens and whatever. But no, okay, fair enough. So the events of the day, as most people know, unfold on April the 13th. Now, one thing that I loved about the Eyewitness Amritsar book that you and Panjab have published was the fact that the first kind of, chapter or a few pages really went into incredible detail, but quite a quick overview of actually what is going on kind of around this fateful day. I've never heard of these people before, and I'm incredibly thankful to have kind of been enlightened about these guys. So everything seems to kind of stem from two people called Kitchelew and Sataypal. So those two guys, April 10th, kind of what are they doing? And then if you could just kind of continue from there in terms of what unfolds and leads us to April the 13th.
Yeah, so we mentioned that these hated Rowlatt Acts. Throughout India, there are all kinds of protests against them. Sometimes those protests go violent. Like, for example, in Delhi, there were quite serious riots, anti-British riots for the Rowlatt Acts. And ironically, well, maybe not ironically, but maybe this tells you why Dyer did what he did. But Dyer, who was in Delhi at the time, so this is early April of 1919, gets caught up in one of those riots. His car is sort of bashed about and it's almost overturned, and him and his family escape from that. But he must have been rattled by it. He must have seen, oh my God, the Indians are revolting against us. But there are lots of these kind of protests and things happening around the big cities. Amritsar is obviously a very big, important city, and the kind of leaders of this political response are these two very well-educated, very gentlemanly men. Dr. Sataypal, a Hindu, Cambridge-educated medical doctor. So, he's a man of some wealth and standing. And then Dr. Kitchelew, by all accounts, a very sort of softly spoken, a very intelligent barrister, a Muslim. And in a sense, they are the kind of political leaders they're the kind of political thinkers and leaders in the Amritsar area, and they're organising protests themselves, which largely involve this idea of stopping the city, these hartals, these days of action where the whole city just stops. And they're very, very smart things to do. It's a very passive way of protesting, but it's also a very smart way of telling the British, look, you may be in control here, but actually we can stop anything happening. We can stop the entire country just by not working. And because the British rule not through the barrel of a gun, they have an army, of course, but they don't really rule through the barrel of a gun. They rule because they run the civil administration, taxes and post offices and all the stuff that makes cities and towns and life work. And if you stop all of that, if Indians just don't participate, it stops India functioning. So they're really powerful, and they were really disliked by British and the Indian government. Amritsar had this kind of it's almost a perfect storm, really, because so it had these very kind of erudite, effective political leaders. It had Sir Michael O'Dwyer, this iron-fisted political leader who was just not going to tolerate that kind of activity going on inside his state. And then there were also rumours or a likelihood that Mahatma Gandhi was going to come to Amritsar as well. So all these things kind of coming together meant that Amritsar suddenly, of all of the places in India where there was this activity happening, there was a sense that, this just needs to be put down now. So on the 10th of April, which is really the fateful day which leads to Jallianwala Bagh, which happens on the 13th, on the 10th of April, Dyer, the political leader, orders that Sataypal and Kitchelew are arrested. And so the local police there, they actually trap them. They say, come for a meeting. Let's talk about this. And as soon as they arrive at the police commissioner's house, they're bundled into a car and sped off out of Panjab. And the effect of that is that those two men who are this kind of perfect interface between the population of Amritsar, which is, frankly, cheesed off. But they're a wonderful interface between them and the British, because they're able to articulate how people feel, they're able to kind of negotiate. But once you pop that cork off the bottle, then what you have left is just this kind of seething crowd, this very angry crowd, and it has nothing to interface with the British. So what happens as soon as it becomes clear that Sataypal and Kitchelew are arrested, and of course you can imagine the rumours that are going around the city. As soon as that happens, you get crowds from Amritsar starting to make their way towards the British area. So the British live these very, very separate lives in India. They often live in just physically different areas. They dress differently, they eat differently, they worship differently, they don't integrate. They live in these areas, often things like civil lines. And that's the case in Amritsar. They live north of the city. And so you see this surge of thousands and thousands of people trying to make it into those areas, largely to protest. But of course, the British response is fearful, and they have men on horses with guns. And on the 10th of April, as the crowds kind of start surging towards the district commissioner's house, so the city commissioner's house, and the police chief's residence, then you get the first few shots being fired from British policemen. You have men falling, you have horses charging the crowds, you have basically what starts as a protest ends up as a riot, and you have all kinds of rumours whistling through the city about what's going on just north of there. And you get then these very infamous incidents like the attack on Marcella Sherwood, who I'm sure we'll talk about as well. So the 10th of April is this day that actually, and I think we say in our book, that had the events of the 13th not happened, had the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh not happened, we would undoubtedly be talking about the 10th of April as one of the darkest days of this kind of imperial history in Punjab, because probably about 20 people were killed on the Indian side. As Indians rioted throughout the city, they were looking for any white faces or Anglo-Indian faces, and a number of people were butchered and killed. Which is really unheard of in British rule. And there were fires, and the bank was looted, and it was a real. It was an incident that would otherwise have been notable, other than it was completely eclipsed by what happened a few days later.
I just actually, because I obviously didn't get far enough in the book, but I just wanted to ask, what actually happens to Kitchelew and Sataypal in the end? Because obviously they get bundled, they get taken away, but once April 13th unfolds, where are they and how do they respond? Like, how do they react to things? Like, what happens to them and how do they kind of respond to the events that unfold?
I mean, in a sense, because they were taken away on the 10th, and because of the martial law that happens shortly thereafter, they don't really have much more of a part to play. So they were bundled into this car, and taken up to Dharamsala on the sort of foothills of the Himalayas, and really held under house arrest. And both of them obviously, went on to live lives, long after. I think they survived all the way to independence as well, and they were kind of elder statesmen of India. But really, they kind of disappear from the story in a sense because they were bundled away.
Oh well, fair enough. So you've already mentioned Marcella Sherwood. Now, a lot of the way that the popular narrative of Jallianwala Bagh gets kind of retold is that the British kind of reaction to, or kind of, it's almost, the attack on Marcella is almost used as the excuse for then what happens at Jallianwala Bagh and kind of the martial law that's brought in and the crawling orders and all the rest of it. Obviously, that's kind of a very popular and very kind of gross narrative. It doesn't really look at the nuance of actually what's going on. So could you possibly just shed some light on that? As in, what actually happens? How does everything kind of connect to one another? Because there's obviously those photos then of people being made to crawl on the floor, but it's a recreation though, rather than it from the time. And again, I think there's a lot of kind of misconceptions around actually what happened and where those photos are from and kind of the events of the day. So starting with Marcella, what happened and then how is that kind of used or not used perhaps by the British in terms of how they kind of narrate their response to that?
So Marcella Sherwood's a school teacher at one of the girls' missionary schools in Amritsar. And so we're still on the 10th when the riots are happening north of the city. But of course, news is spreading throughout the old city itself. And she's cycling through the gullies of old Amritsar, and a crowd surrounded her. She was a white face, wrong place, wrong time, that kind of thing. And they brought her down off her bike and beat her up, frankly, and probably would have killed her. But she was rescued actually by locals in that area, including a guy called Gyan Singh, the one who's usually named as being one of the people that sort of saved her, brought her into his house. I think his daughters had either gone to her school or gone to one of the missionary schools. So it wasn't, and you can imagine, right? There are people who will want to see death and destruction, and there are people who will not want to see that happening in their community. So she's both beaten up by Indians and then saved by Indians. But I think the thing with Marcella Sherwood is that she's a young woman who's assaulted by Indians, and the idea of that has just crossed the line. Crosses a line that the British just couldn't stomach, which is why that one incident, which is, no worse than, I think it was the bank. I think there was a bank manager on Hal Bazaar who was thrown from the top of his building and then beaten up and burned alive. Clearly it's not as gruesome as an incident as that, but it's the Marcella Sherwood assault, which really frightened the British, that really seemed to capture the imagination of the British. And you could tell that certainly with Dyer, because in the days, and now we're going to go to the days after Jallianwala Bagh, when he's established martial law on the city, so he's committed the massacre, and then in trying to settle the city, he wants to also see sort of justice. And he instituted this really humiliating punishment for the attack on Marcella Sherwood, which was at the place where she was assaulted in the gully that she was brought down on her bike, that any locals there would have to crawl on their bellies to pass through that point. And it was a very visible punishment. It was a humiliating punishment. The photographs and the pictures that you see, there's two types. There are some actually which are contemporary of the time. I think the ones that we published in Warrior Saints, and then again in the book which show men in their pith helmets. So men of I think it's the 25 London cycles in their pith helmets, and then a man crawling on the ground, and then they photographed it. It's all kind of jokes that they're having. But then there are some other photographs which, if you look at them, you actually see Indian men standing and then Indian men on the ground. Those are taken later on when the sort of commissions, the Congress commissions are trying to sort of recreate for the purpose of the documentation what took place. But that event is also then picked up by cartoonists, artists, and illustrators, because it's a kind of almost a perfect image of British rule in India, or at least the most nationalistic view of British rule in India, that it's done under the kind of hobnailed boot of a white British soldier.
Yeah, I was just listening to that and just taking it all in, because I just think the more that you dig into Jallianwala Bagh, the more kind of I feel like it's very much like a rabbit hole, because there is so much more information. Thank you for that. So this question, I guess, actually jumps to perhaps after the events, but again, I'm sure you can correct me if I've got that one wrong. So this is something that I've only ever heard before, kind of in passing, from other people, and again, I read it in your book, which was that there was a plan to actually bomb Amritsar. Where does this plan come from? Why did it get shelved? And also, how did the information for this get out? Because even the kind of the idea of bombing Amritsar would very likely cause a lot of hysteria, rioting, whatever, as in it would cause some type of reaction. So what's going on there, and why doesn't that actually happen?
So there are a couple of things going on. So after the 10th, the 10th is this kind of a bit of a turning point. These horrible riots that take place. Dyer, the army officer, I think he was in Jallianwala on the actual 10th. He got news of it. He has no jurisdiction over Amritsar. He has no need to be up there. He has no place to go there. He's stationed in Jallianwala. He really should have stayed, but his character doesn't kind of let him. So he gets on the train and he goes up to take charge, right? So he goes up on the evening of the 11th up to Amritsar. And what was happening at the time is the 10th has happened. Everyone's kind of licking their wounds on the 11th. Obviously, funerals are taking place on the 11th, and there's a sense that something needs to happen. So the British response to it was just to kind of lock everything down, and that's where the idea of the bombings comes in. It wasn't as an act of offence, although it would have caused huge offence, of course. It wasn't an act of offence. It was a threat to say, if there's any more gathering that takes place, we're going to bomb you. Right? So it was a threat that took place, and one that they were fully prepared for. So it wasn't an empty threat. Also, I don't think we put this in the book, but there is reference to bombing Gurdaspur, which is obviously just sort of north and east of Amritsar as well, because Gurdaspur had seen rioting as a result of the Amritsar rioting on the 11th. So there was preparation made for, right, well, let's just bomb them, right? So this is aerial bombing, right? But again, that didn't take place either. So the 11th was this kind of slightly discombobulating day where people didn't quite know, well, what happens next? There wasn't the energy for rioting again. Dyer had come up by the evening of the 11th, was setting up his sort of headquarters at Rambagh Gardens. The British had left their homes and their residences and had all were all holed up in Gobind Fort, which most people know is just outside the walled city, is obviously very well fortified. So they were there tending to their injured. And then by the morning of the 12th, Dyer goes into the city on the 12th to issue proclamations. Dyer had never been to Amritsar. He didn't know this city at all, right? So he then leads his men into the city on the 12th to issue these proclamations to say, there'll be no more gatherings, there'll be no more political stuff. There'll be no gatherings over a certain number of people. It just kind of went on and on and on. But the point was that he didn't really understand the city and how it worked. I think they issued 3 or 4 proclamations around sort of random bits of the city. So it's very unclear whether any of that would really have been understood or whether people would really have cared, frankly, because they've been through this enormous trauma, of course, of the writing of a few days before. So that's the setup then for what happens on the 13th.
No, thank you. So you previously also mentioned why everyone was gathering there, obviously because kind of a response to Kitchelew and Sataypal being bundled into the back of a car and kind of taken away. Now, a question that got asked a number of times when I put out kind of just that we were doing this podcast was which regiments were involved in the firing in the shooting that takes place. It's listed, I think, it's definitely listed in your book. I think I'm pretty sure it was in Wagner's book as well. And I think you can find that online. But if you could just kind of shed some light on which regiments were involved in the massacre, and were they aware of what they were going to do, and also kind of tied in with all of that is, were there any that refused? Were there any that were just point blank, I'm not going to do this? Yeah.
So as you said, there'd always been a call for a gathering on the day of Vaisakhi on the 13th at Jallianwala Bagh for a political meeting in response to the arrest of Sataypal and Kitchelew. So the idea was that they were going to make political speeches. I think they were going to read letters from the 2 men as well. Now, the Bagh is a big place, and that would have been something that would have been happening in one part of it. The 13th, as we all know, is also Vaisakhi as well. So there would have just been a natural gathering that would have taken place there.
Sorry to butt in, but didn't you also mention in your book that there were cattle markets that were taking place, and because of the restrictions that the British had put in, they weren't on, and so there were more people?
Yeah, so remember, this is a time of imperfect communication, right? There would have been traditionally that in Vaisakhi there would have been a cattle market that was taking place. That had been cancelled. I mean, actually, free movement was cancelled anyway. So it's a kind of a double-edged sword. So there would have been a cattle market. So people would have been coming to Amritsar anyway, and suddenly found that the whole thing was cancelled. So you kind of end up at places like Jallianwala Bagh in any case. Conversely, whereas Amritsar would have seen people coming from other parts of Panjab because of Vaisakhi, that would not have happened. People from Lahore and maybe as far away as Jalandhar as well would not have made it because the trains weren't running in any case. So there were definitely crowds that were kind of gathering in Amritsar in any case. And they gathered at Jallianwala Bagh. There's this political meeting that's taking place. It's not clear just how popular that would have been, how many of the crowds were there to listen to those political speeches. It's clear from the victims that there's such a diverse range of them that not all of them were there to listen to political, 15-year-old boys are not there to listen to political speeches. So, people were there for a whole variety of reasons. And it's but the idea that there's a crowd in Jallianwala Bagh, that notion gets back to an absolutely furious Reginald Dyer up in Ram Bagh, because he had issued his proclamations as far as he's concerned, the good Indians have got to do their thing at that moment. So he gathers, to get to the heart of your question, he gathers men around him drawn from the regiments that were barracked there at the time. So it's the 9th Gurkhas, which would have been made up of Gurkhas, the 54th Sikhs, and then the 59th Sindh Rifles. Now, it's tempting when you see a regiment name like the 54th Sikhs to think, oh, they're all going to be Sikh men. But they're not. These regiment names don't necessarily mean that that's what they're made up of. There could well have been Sikhs in there, could well have been, because it's made up of, I think, Baluchis and Sikhs. So there's a likelihood that there would have been Sikh men. Of course, in the popular Indian kind of visualization of what happens in Jallianwala Bagh, including in Attenborough's film Gandhi, they're all Gurkhas, right? They're always depicted as Gurkhas because Indians don't like to think that their own people were involved in it. Did anyone refuse to shoot? There's no evidence of that. There's actually very little. In fact, there's no. Even though we know the names of victims, we don't know the names of the Indian perpetrators. They're not listed, they're not noted, they're not in the records. We certainly don't have testimony for many of them. One of Dyer's British sort of ADC types gave evidence at the Hunter Commission, and I think gave some testimony later on as well. And that's the only other voice that you hear. But from the Indians themselves, from the Indian soldiers themselves, absolutely nothing, unfortunately.
So even though, so we know the names of the regiments that go in, but there's no actual list of the actual names of the soldiers, though.
No.
Oh, okay, that's incredibly helpful. And I'm assuming there's no way of working backwards in terms of saying like, well, if we know it's the 54th Sikhs in 1919, then could you not look at, like, I don't know, is there not some record from like the following years of the same regiment, or does it not work like that?
So you can quickly see you can very easily see the names of officers and what they call non-commissioned officers, so fairly senior Indian officers of the regiment, but the common man is never noted in published works. You can find all sorts of names of people that served in the 54th and the 59th in that period of time. Tying them into that event, I've not seen anything. We've not seen anything noted. It's also notable that they never gave any kind of testimony. They never. Maybe it's obvious, really, but one thing you find about Jallianwala Bagh is everyone has an ancestor that was there, right? I bump into so many people like, oh yeah, my great grandfather was at Jallianwala Bagh. He hid under a body. He did X, Y, Z. But nobody has ever claimed that their great grandfather was part of the 45 men that fired rifles on that day. Maybe for obvious reasons.
Yeah, no, fair. I was actually going to ask, how come none of these soldiers were called up during any of these committees, like the Hunter Committee or the inquiries that the Congress Party go and do? But
from a British perspective, they did their duty, right?
Yeah. As in, they were protecting their own.
Well, yeah, to some extent protecting their own, but to some extent, the soldiers did. They followed orders, right? The Hunter Commission really concerned itself with who gave the orders and were the orders right, and were not the men. In fact, it's an act of mutiny not to follow orders.
So in any way, they were doing, in the eyes of the army, exactly what they were meant to. Yeah, fair.
Yeah. And I doubt that the Indian commissions would have ever got access.
No, fair. And then at the same, I guess you've actually kind of answered this, which is there's a lot of people who claim to have had family members that were there on the day, but obviously very few who claim that their family members were part of those soldiers who did the shooting. Because someone had asked, what do we know if much of the actual crowd that were there that day? And
yeah, actually that's slightly better known, Ahmed, because I think one of the most remarkable parts of this whole story is that the soon as martial law is lifted and there's access then to the city, which happens a few days afterwards, the emerging Indian National Congress, it's not Congress, it's a different group, send a group up there. So amongst them are Motilal Nehru, who's Jawaharlal Nehru's father. Jawaharlal Nehru, who's a young man in 1919, an Anglican clergyman called Charles Freer, and a bunch of others. And they go up there to try to understand what's taken place, but also document. This is the really critical thing. They go around, they try to document exactly what happened, and they take testimony. And they're helped by, there's a local charitable group called Seva Samiti, and they do this remarkable thing where they go door to door around the city of Amritsar, and they say, right, who in your family was affected? You know, they were shot or and they're only looking for death and injury, in fairness, not attendance. And it's like a big 19th century or early 20th century spreadsheet that they fill in, where they've got the name and the father's name and, you know, the profession and the age and the type of injury that took place, etc. And it's all there, it's all documented. So we know an awful lot about the demographics of the crowd as a result of that. I think we published a page or two of that in our book. And then I did some stats with Kim for his book around it. So you get a really good picture of the kind of crowd, the ages that you have, the breadth, the range of people who are there. So, I mean, that's probably, and of course, you know, the question that dogs all of this, which is, you know, how many people died. It's just a bit of a crude measure, but it's one that seems to never go away.
Just then, in relation to the research you guys did in relation to the crowd, what is the kind of the total number of people roughly that are present? What are kind of the gender ratios? Did you guys do any kind of research into like caste or anything? Did anything kind of interesting come up, or was it, I guess, kind of like what you guys expected from, or like, of that time?
So you got to remember what Amritsar is like in 1919. So, you know, right now we see it as a very sick city. If I put you in a time machine and took you to Amritsar of 1918, you would be surprised because it would be a largely Muslim city, right? Just over half of the population is Muslim, like 30% or so is Hindu, and 15% is Sikh. So it's very different. It's been completely ethnically cleansed as the city of Amritsar. It was a Muslim, there were a lot of Muslims there. That said, in the Bagh, judging by the people who were killed, there were mainly Hindus and Sikhs in the Bagh. Not surprisingly, it's a Vaisakhi thing, right? But that said, of course, there were a lot of Muslim victims. So most of the people killed were Hindu men. Then I can't remember the exact split, but I think it goes Sikhs and then Muslims. I think it's something like that. They were almost all men. I think there were 2 females amongst them. Probably a reflection of, you know, big public spaces and who's in there. The range of ages is quite shocking. Lots of young boys. There's a baby, all the way up to very elderly men, who I always kind of sort of think of as just like you see today in green spaces in things, just probably just sitting there playing cards, chatting with their friends, you know, because that's how you socialize, right? And a very, very broad range of kind of professions. And there's I'm going to say ice cream seller. I can't remember how he described himself. It might have been ice cream, actually. So, you know, it has the picture you build up is that of a kind of a carnival day, a festival day, people kind of there for kicks. Some people there, no doubt, earnest young men to listen to the political discourse, but old guys playing cards. That's the impression that you get. And then, of course, the firing is completely indiscriminate. It's just into the crowd. And if you've been there, as you said you had, you'll know that as you come through that very narrow passageway, it just opens up in front of you. There's really nothing. You go through this very, very narrow passage, and then the whole Bagh just opens up. And Dyer positioned his men right in front of that passageway on a slightly raised bank of ground. And people would have been just literally just meters in front. We think that there was something like 15 to 20,000 people. That's numbers drawn from the Hunter Commission as well as the Indian Commission. So, there's a vast number of people in there. The other thing you'll know from that space, God knows what it looks like now, but if you went in 2001, you'll know that there aren't really entrances and exits to this thing. The city butts up right to the edge of it, and there are two other exits, both of which are very narrow. One which was locked shut, and then the other one which had been so narrow it was, you can just imagine it just getting locked very quickly. But there was also absolutely no cover in that area as well. From the photographs which were taken shortly afterwards, there's a single tree in there, a single tree in that sort of vast space about the size of Trafalgar Square. And there's a samad, little stone building in there. And there's a well, but today when you would have seen it, the well was quite embellished with a cover and all the rest of it. It wasn't anywhere near as big and important a structure as that. So there's absolutely no cover, and they're just ordered to fire into the densest part of the crowd. This is an act of terror. It's an act of. It's very much like the martial law that follows. It's a show, but it's a show at the expense of the lives of many, many hundreds of people.
I think one thing that also struck me when we went, and obviously I don't know, I think I'd also probably have a similar reaction at this age now, but considering I was 11, when you saw the well and you looked down, you were taken aback just by the depth of it. So then to add on to that, the fact that people were jumping in out of sheer desperation really kind of, in a way, made it quite a visceral kind of reality in terms of it really brings that to the forefront in terms of actually how fearful or kind of how much in danger must someone have felt to actually plunge themselves essentially to a even worse death in a sense, to escape what was happening.
Well, I can I address that for a second? Because I think, and no doubt there was as you said, absolute terror amongst people. There is the well is one of the great enduring myths, one of the many enduring myths of Jallianwala Bagh. It's highly unlikely that anyone threw themselves down the well. And I know that when you went, you would have seen a sign saying Martyr's Well, and 150 bodies were pulled out of here or something along those lines. Yeah, there's no evidence that happened. Nobody gives testimony to a well at any time in those days shortly afterwards when they're giving testimony to the to Congress, to the Nehrus, etc. The well isn't mentioned. There's a single reference to a body in the well, but when they pull that out, it's just some fabric or clothes or something that's in there. There's a possibility of, and Kim Wagner does such a really nice forensic job on this, just trying to get underneath it a little bit. The water for the Barsab, the Barsab is really close by, right? The water for the Sarovar in the Barsab comes from a covered canal, essentially, that runs through the city. And that goes right under Jallianwala Bagh. And it's covered by these kind of almost like concrete slabs, but it runs very close to the surface. And there's a testimony of people kind of lifting up or just parting those concrete slabs and sliding underneath that to try to take cover. And so there's a possibility that gets confused for bodies being, people throwing themselves in the well. But the Martyr's Well thing really gets popularized around about the time of partition, when there are stories of women throwing themselves in wells during the rioting of of partition. And I think that's where it actually comes from. But it's one of the many myths. This is a historic event only 100 years ago, where it seems to have created lots and lots and lots of myths, and the well is one of them. The numbers is another one. Udham Singh is another one. It kind of goes on and on.
No, it does, and I'm glad that you've smashed that myth, because it's something that is certainly, it's just reproduced ad infinitum. And I guess we kind of highlighted towards at the beginning how there's a very popular narrative of Jallianwala Bagh, which isn't necessarily reflective, as we've just seen, of the reality. So no, thank you. You also touched on another. There was another question actually before this, which was you referenced that the soldiers were only meters away from the crowd. How much are we talking, in terms of distance?
I think the first few people would have been, I think we said it's something like 5 to 10 meters away. And one of the reasons we know that is because the bullets went through multiple bodies, which means they must have been very close. I mean, obviously, as soon as the firing started, people would have scattered. Those able-bodied and fast enough to have done that. But it's also very clear that the first rounds of firing were not over the heads, right? Which is what you do to scare people, right? It's very clear that those initial, and there was no warning given either. That's known from Dyer's testimony and from the testimony of eyewitnesses that we've reproduced in the book. They came, they gathered, he ordered them to fire, reload, fire, reload, fire, reload. There's a moment when his AD, I think it was his ADC, says to him, is that enough? Well, that's enough. I think we've done our job. And he says, nope, carry on, and actually orders them to fire towards thicker parts of the crowd, and I think towards the tree as well, where people were trying to get shelter up into the in the tree itself. But continues to fire till they're almost exhausted of their ammunition. And he only didn't stop, not because he thought he had done enough, but because he thought he needed to preserve ammunition in order to exit the city. So that he would, as a military man, he would not have exhausted his ammunition and then tried to make his way out of the city, so he needed to preserve some. There's in the Hunter Commission that had the entranceway been wide enough, the armoured car would have joined in the firing as well, and no doubt that the death would have been even greater as a result of it. So it's a horrific, completely merciless attack on people that absolutely had, and that not a single shot is fired in return. Tells you that this is not any kind of, there is no threat coming from the other direction.
Well, there was one stat from, I think it was your book, which kind of puts it into context a little bit, which was that I think in 10 minutes or approximately 10 minutes, something like 1,600 rounds of ammunition had been spent. Now, you can do the maths, that's 160 odd bullets just a minute, and then you're talking per second, that's 2 bullets a second being fired at a crowd which are unarmed. Okay, so the events of April 13th happen, as in the Dyer walks through, gives his commands, they shoot everyone down, they leave. What unfolds kind of, from that point onwards, what unfolds, or how does Dyer in this case come into play? And then also, what is the kind of the overall reaction? And I guess this also leads on to another question which I'll ask in a minute, which is related to kind of how the information comes out, because I think one of the earliest newspaper reports I found on it, which was from the 14th of April, says, news has been received from the Punjab that the Amritsar mob has again broken out in a violent attack against the authorities. The rebels were repulsed by the military and they suffered 200 casualties. And so that's obviously incredibly, that narrative is incredibly different to everything we've just discussed. So, as a result of obviously the events, what unfolds and like how does that get managed or mismanaged, I guess?
Well, managed is a really good word for it, actually, Ahmed, because so as soon as the firing is done, remember this is an era, of course, when there isn't rapid movement of information around, and then that's just because it's 1919, right? And then on top of that, of course, there's this kind of lockdown that's happening in northern India because of the Rowlatt riots and protests as well. And Amritsar is particularly on lockdown. There's no trains moving in and out, so information is going to be difficult to come by. But Dyer writes a report up to Dyer, and that's where that 200 comes from. So his versions, his sort of managing of the information is such that says, there's this. He doesn't talk about gathering. He talks about rebels. The rebels, that's what he calls them, which is very redolent of the language used in 1857. So as far as Dyer sort of sees it, although he doesn't really make many inquiries, what Dyer has done has avoided a greater rebellion taking place in Amritsar, like a repeat of the 10th on a larger scale. And so he writes back and says, I can't remember the precise words that he uses, but yeah, I've got your back. Kind of thing, you've done good. The Governor General agrees or something. I can't remember what the precise words were. And then Dyer institutes martial law in Amritsar for a period of a week or so, and so that further prevents information getting out. But as soon as information does get out, as soon as that martial law ends, and to some extent, to his credit, Dyer was part of that, although he never criticised Dyer, so I shouldn't give him too much credit. As soon as that happens, then and the scale of the actual massacre is clear, and the motives of both Dyer is clear, and the fact that this was completely unarmed, peaceful people. There is quite a sort of naturally shocking reaction, both from Indians in India, but also, quite unusually actually, by the political classes in the UK. Not so much by the British in India, right? So the British in India, they know their sort of slightly precarious position, and they're not going to criticise one of their own. So there's either silence or support for Dyer amongst the British in India. But politically in the UK, there's a call for a commission, and even earlier than that, there's a call for Dyer to be, that his presence in India is not conducive to peaceful rule. And then, of course, the commission takes over. I mean, the problem with these commissions and reports is they take ages, right? So it takes a lot of the kind of heat out of it. Dyer's Dyer defends himself for both the Hunter Commission and occasionally publicly. And one of his sort of strongest arguments is that he enjoys enormous public support in Britain. And that's always something that we should bear in mind. So we sort of famously know that the Morning Post starts this kind of, fund for Dyer, and it raises the equivalent of £1 million for him. And I think it's just worth noting that the British public saw Dyer as doing a positive, good thing. Or, whether they were reading that through the newspapers and making their minds up through that, or whether there was actually a sense that what he did was for the greater good, I don't really know. But it is worth noting that, because often we kind of quote the Winston Churchill and Asquith and those sorts, but the British public were not as revolted by what happened as the political classes were, which is unusual.
One of the questions actually on the list was considering people like Churchill and Asquith condemned the attack and kind of seemed to out him as well, how was Dyer able to kind of have such mass public support? And to be honest, you've already answered it. So, thank you for that. Actually,
Yeah, and Churchill in 1919 and Asquith, and Churchill wasn't the Prime Minister, by the way, right?
No, Secretary of State.
Yeah, and just because the political classes go for something doesn't mean that the great British public do.
Yeah. I guess it's also the implications that, like, within politics, there are various reasons for wanting to do X, Y, and Z. So I'm sure there's more to this than meets the eye.
Yeah, and it's not the liberal politics that we think of today. It's the preservation of state, isn't it? That maybe the foresight that they had to say, well, actually, we're going to lose India if we keep doing shit like this, right? So it's not about the Indians. It's about the British rule.
Yeah, no, definitely.
What's a moral response? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's not like some moral response. It's more so keeping political control. You alluded to it earlier, and everyone asked me this question, which is, how do Bhagat Singh and Udham Singh connect to this history of Jallianwala Bagh? And then the other question was in relation to Dyer getting the siropa, the Darbar Sahib, after Jallianwala Bagh. They're kind of the two main bits that I just wanted to get your input on, please.
The Udham Singh's really interesting. Bhagat Singh I don't know too much about, actually, so you caught me off on that one. But the Udham Singh one is really interesting. I'm not convinced Udham Singh was actually there during 1919. He said maybe I shouldn't doubt him because I think he said he was. And so why is it for me to say that he wasn't? But he did say an awful lot of things, and he did contradict himself multiple times, so he's not always the most reliable witness in the world. There is this funny, he doesn't need to be there, right? To do what he did, which is that he 20 years later shot and killed Sir Michael O'Dwyer. To do what he did, he didn't need to have been there. Because the actual event itself was so visceral. It went to the heart of, Punjabis in general. You don't need to have been there to be affected by it. Sometimes I think, there's a need for us to place these people there in order to kind of to make the story, to give the story even more pathos. But I'm not convinced. I think, because I did write a short biography of Udham Singh years ago for the Dictionary of National Biography, and I did some research around kind of his movements, and I'm fairly convinced he was in Africa at the time because he joined the Indian Army, and I think the regiment he was in was posted to East Africa at the time. I might be wrong, but not sure he was there, but I'm sure that it loomed large on his consciousness, just like it did for many people. And for him, like a common, like a normal Punjabi, Sir Michael O'Dwyer would have been a much bigger figure as he was growing up, as he was, when he thought of Imperial Britain, he would have thought of Sir Michael O'Dwyer. Whereas Dyer is a character that kind of comes in, commits this act, and then kind of shuffles off again. But most people wouldn't have really known him other than as this kind of the pantomime villain of the piece. If you've read Anita Nunn's really brilliant biography, A Patient Assassin, you'll kind of see the evolution of Udham Singh and why why Jallianwala Bagh is such an important this kind of pivotal moment in leading him to do what he did. Although I sort of slightly take issue with the notion that he was like a patient assassin, like he'd been kind of waiting to do it his whole life. I don't think that's quite what happens. In the same way that if somebody avenges, what happened in 1984, they don't have to have been a patient assassin. I think we've all kind of grown up knowing what happened then, and it's not even a case of you having to have been there in 84. You don't even have to have been born in 84 to know what a horrific moment that is. So I don't think that's what she's claiming, by the way, but it's a funny title. So and Bhagat Singh, I must confess, I don't really know too much more about what was the other question? You had a really good question I wanted to. Oh, Siropa, the Siropa, the Baza. Yeah, so it's Dyer, General Dyer, the man who leads people into the Bagh, kills, close to 1,000 people right on the doorstep of the Darbar Sahib, who's then, and he's not just given a Siropa by the manager, quote-unquote manager of the Darbar Sahib. He's not just given a Siropa. So this is all testimony in the diary of, I think, the wife of one of Dyer's officers, if I remember correctly. He's invited there for kind of, sort of a dinner. And they say the manager and his kind of, lackeys kind of go, "Oh, Dyer, you're a great man. You've brought order back to Amritsar. Here's a Siropa. We want to make you into an honorary Sikh." And I go, no. I can't be a Sikh. I enjoy my cigars far too much, right? I smoke 20 a day or something. I can't remember what he said. And this manager guy goes, "Don't worry, we'll let you quit one cigar a year or something until you quit completely." So there's this. It's a kind of like old boys club, backslapping type of thing that goes on. I mean, it's embarrassing, isn't it, that took place, but it's a function of British control in the Punjab, that in the Darbar Sahib, that the management of it, and it's a position, I keep referring to this word manager because it's a position that's created by the British. It's not one that has antecedents in the Sikh world. But that position is given to someone who is like not just the most loyal, but the most sort of, just the most supportive of British rule. Doesn't matter what happens, and that's because the Darbar Sahib and that centre of the Sikh world is seen as being, potentially a source of sedition. So we need to control it.
Okay, there was just kind of two bits that I wanted just to get your final input on, because I think we've kind of covered a great deal of information, which is just the two inquiries that happened post Jallianwala Bagh. So you've already alluded, one's the Hunter Committee and then one is the Congress Punjab inquiry, I think, if I'm correct. Kind of where did these inquiries originate from? Why are there obviously two? And what are their findings? And how are they taken by, I guess, I don't know whether the public is the right word, because as we've kind of seen, like, that's quite diverse, like political class kind of take things in a particular way. And for some reason, most of the British public kind of support Dyer. But like, do they change anything in the narrative, or are they kind of quite repetitive of kind of what had already been put out?
No, they're enormously helpful, actually, because they, conclusions aside, because the conclusions are mired in, as you said, right, like the politics of the time and sentiment, they take testimony. And it's the testimony that's really, really important for historians, for those of us that are looking back on it, because you actually get what's going on. So there's, as you said, there's a Hunter Commission and then there's an Indian Commission. And the Hunter Commission set up by the Indian government, and the idea is, because fundamentally there's just a dispute about exactly what happened, is to get to the bottom of precisely what happened and what should we do about it. Undoubtedly, there was pressure from the British government because they wanted the Dyer expelled from India, and he wasn't going to do it. He wasn't going to resign. Now, the Hunter Commission included Indian members, right? So that's been a fairly long-standing part of British rule, is that there's Indians involved in governance in some form or another. But helpfully or unhelpfully, I'm not sure which way it is, the actual Hunter Commission split between white people and brown people. So there was both the Hunter Commission report and a minority report written by the Indian members of the Hunter Commission, both of which are really helpful, actually, because you really get a sense of what's going on in people's minds. And then completely separate to that, totally separate to that, there's the Indian Congress report that's going on as well, which takes testimony actually from, I think it's like 800 Indians. That is phenomenally important and helpful, again, from an Indian's perspective, because they did the job that we want to do, which is to really take eyewitness testimony of what happened, what took place, what the people hear. So you can build up a really good picture of what took place. Now, there were a number of sort of recommendations of the Hunter Committee, the Minority Report, and the Indian National Congress report. The only thing that they all agreed on was that Dyer's presence in India was unacceptable, that he should resign and leave. Obviously, the Indian reports went further to say that he should face a trial, criminal trial. And the Indians report also put some blame onto Dyer, but not a huge amount. So the ones that obviously the government listened to is the Majority Report from the Hunter Commission itself. And so that's why it took a year, but that's why Dyer leaves India, comes back to the UK he resigns his post and comes back to the UK about a year afterwards in 1920. And then Dyer, as a kind of a classic establishment get out, because he's due to finish his stint in India in 1919 anyway. So they just kind of see him through. So he leaves with a little bit more status, honor, whatever you want to call it. So he comes off of it a little bit more unscathed than Dyer does. But Dyer obviously comes back to the UK as a very popular hero because of the Morning Post, even though he's excoriated in Parliament by the House of Commons.
Okay. This is then just this is a question I asked you in the last podcast as well, but I just think, given the context of Jallianwala Bagh and everything we've just gone through, how were the British still able to conscript so many, in this context, Punjabis? Like, I'm not necessarily concerned about the rest of India in this context, but Punjabis in the Second World War, considering how visceral Jallianwala Bagh is and how it's kind of, perhaps this is a product of the time that we're in and kind of how the history is developed, and that it, like, Jallianwala Bagh is connected to Udham Singh, Bhagat. It's almost connected to every type of revolutionary history or kind of independence history within India. I guess also the fact is World War II, like, India's still not independent, so those narratives haven't quite built up. But for me, I find it quite mind-boggling that kind of 20 years later, you have this huge call up to arms, and there is quite largely mass support for it, and people kind of go back out, especially again after how you had said with the First World War, there was this kind of idea that the Indians expected some dominion status, not even independence. They expected something in kind of return for everything that they were providing during the First World War.
I think there's lots of reasons. I think there's lots of reasons for it. It is literally 20 years later. I think that has a big part to play. I think life is cheap in India. We talked about the flu killing tens and hundreds of thousands of people in the Panjab. I'm not diminishing what happened in Amritsar at all, but life is cheap, right? People are dying and being killed for all kinds of things. So whereas Jallianwala Bagh, we sort of see this totally merciless massacre, which obviously it is. It may not have had that widespread resonance, as much of that widespread resonance around Punjab. It certainly may not have in the life of a boy in a village, which is where men were drawn from. And for the life of a man in a young man, a boy in a village who's probably born during the time of Jallianwala Bagh or thereafter, so it doesn't have that kind of adult reckoning of it. A job in the army being recruited in the army comes with opportunity and salary, pension and status. Recruitment was very sophisticated. Michael O'Dwyer had actually pioneered, just how to do mass recruitment into the army, not just in Punjab, but it was seen as being a model for the rest of India. So in the Second World War, First World War veterans were were the models of recruitment in a sense. They were people that were going around the villages saying, look, you could have all of this as a result of joining the Indian Army. And it's not as if joining the Indian Army was easy either. They were turning away as many as they were recruiting because they weren't fit enough or cool enough. So this was a job which came with a certain amount of status as well. And then just have a think about, again, for that common man, the environment that he's in, where every single source of power is telling him joining the army is the right thing to do. I mean, literally everyone, right the way from the Governor General in Delhi all the way down to the local Tahsildar, and even the opposition politics as well, as saying, this is the right thing to. Remember, the Congress is recruiting men into the Second World War. It's saying this is a positive, good thing to do. Mahatma Gandhi says, if you don't want to fight, become an ambulance driver. So it's the super exceptional that kind of saying, oh no, actually the politics don't stack up, and I can foresee a time when what Jallianwala Bagh is actually a kind of a precursor to independence. It's almost
impossible. Would it be fair to say, though, that those, if anyone at that time was able to take that stance, it'd be a place of privilege? Because actually, those who were volunteered and kind of included, there's like a social economic pull to it in terms of it brings prestige, it brings status, it brings pay, it brings security. And so actually to be able to say no to that requires a certain element of social economic stability in the first place, which, considering the makeup of Punjab, would have been very unlikely.
Yep, I think that's absolutely true. There's this remarkable archive that I'm working on at the moment, which is the First World War, where the British are making notes of people. As a recruiting in Punjab, they're making a note that, this is actually the eldest son, because that's quite an unusual thing to happen for the eldest son to do it, because the younger sons are much more likely to recruit because they don't have options and opportunity and the likelihood to have family, etc. So they're the ones that you'd expect to get, but the elder sons is quite an unusual thing. So yes, it is. The notion of privilege is actually quite an interesting one.
Yeah, no, I just thought in that context, I couldn't think of what else it is that gives you that ability. So just finally ending then. So we obviously know Dyer gets assassinated by Udham Singh in Claxton Hall. What happens to Dyer? Yeah, so Dyer kind of goes back to a life of, it goes into a sort of retirement, but it's not a very happy retirement. There's a debate in the House of Commons shortly after he returns, which he sits in the visitors gallery and listens to, and he's just excoriated by MPs and members of the government. So he's personally really humiliated by that. So even though he got this kind of almost hero's welcome from the public, politically, that event really hurt him personally. The debate moved then into the House of Lords, where he got a much warmer sort of, at a personal level, a warmer kind of reaction. I guess it's the kind of old establishment there. But he then kind of really withdrew to a cottage that they had bought in Devon with the money that had been raised for him, and lived out a quite sickly existence there. I mean, there's little reference to him, coming back to London every now and again. I think he's got married or something, but really not much more than that. And he kind of he definitely withdrew from public life. He was not, unlike O'Dwyer, who continued to kind of, thump on around about India and the righteousness of British rule in India. Dyer didn't do that at all. And instead just kind of, lived out his kind of a quieter existence until he died in 1927.
Yeah, until he died in 1927. Yeah. Oh, crikey. It's funny because the book that we've written, which is Eyewitness at Amritsar, which is all about eyewitness accounts and contemporary photography of the time. He always looks so much older than he actually was. Even when he's in his 30s, he looks like he's in his 50s. I think he's in his 50s. But you might want to check that. I actually don't know.
Yeah, I just quickly Googled it. Wikipedia says 62. So, yeah. No, thank you, actually. That was incredibly insightful. And I think the bit that I really enjoyed was the fact that there were a number of myths which you very, very eloquently kind of dismantled. And I think this is what I really enjoy about history, is actually getting underneath the kind of the popular narratives and actually kind of seeing what the closer to the reality in terms of the nitty gritty and the nuance of it. I've gone through all of the questions that I wanted to cover. I just wanted to check, is there anything that you wanted to include or go over, or anything in particular that you want to mention?
That was super comprehensive, and we said we would try to keep it to a tight hour, and it's been 2. So I think we very comprehensively talked.
Yeah, definitely. As always, I can't say thank you enough. I really do appreciate the help and the input and the support that you provide, as well as everyone else. So yeah, thank you so much for your morning as well.
My absolute pleasure. More power to you, Ahmed. I think what you're doing is extraordinary. Happy to help and support you in any way possible, because I think I love what you're doing. I love where it's going as well.
No, thank you so much. And also thank you for talking for so long, even with post kind of feeling better as well. And I can imagine how your throat must feel. So I won't keep you any longer. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. And again, thank you so much for your continued support.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Not a problem. Take care.